By the end of the night, the people who had spent 3 hours pretending not to see Claire Whitman would be standing on their feet, clapping for the woman they had mistaken for no one. But at 7:18 p.m., when she stepped through the revolving doors of the Copley Grand Hotel in downtown Boston, she was just a quiet woman in a navy dress, carrying a small black clutch and wearing no jewelry except a thin silver watch that had belonged to her mother. The lobby smelled of polished marble, white lilies, and money pretending to be generosity. Beyond the ballroom doors, the Harbor Light Children's Foundation Gala was already glowing with chandeliers, champagne flutes, and the careful laughter of people who measured kindness by whether a photographer was nearby. Claire paused at the entrance just long enough for her reflection to catch in the brass trim of the doorway. 38 years old, pale skin, soft brown hair pinned low at the back of her neck, calm gray eyes that had learned the expensive way not to give every feeling a place on her face. She did not look like someone who could change the fate of a hospital wing. She looked, if anyone bothered to look closely, like a woman who had survived being underestimated so many times that underestimation had become almost useful. 3 years earlier, rooms like this had belonged to Grant Whitman. Grant, her ex-husband, had loved rooms with tall ceilings and important men. He had loved walking into them with Claire beside him, not because he wanted her voice there, but because her silence made him look stable. Claire prefers simple things, he used to say, smiling as if he were praising her. People always nodded. They heard sweet, gentle, modest. Claire heard small. She heard manageable. She heard the soft click of a glass case closing around her life. Tonight, Grant was somewhere inside that ballroom with Vanessa Cole, the woman who had replaced her in photographs, dinner invitations, and the sort of conversations where wives were discussed like accessories with opinions kept tastefully hidden. Claire had almost stayed home. The invitation had sat on her kitchen counter for 2 weeks, cream cardstock, raised gold. Lettering, a little too proud of itself, because apparently even paper can develop an ego when rich people touch it. But then she saw Margaret Ellis listed as the foundation director, and that changed everything. Margaret had been kind to Claire when kindness had not benefited her. Years ago, at one of Grant's endless donor dinners, when everyone else had asked Claire what Grant was working on, Margaret had asked what Claire cared about. It had been such a small question. It had also been the first one in months that did not make Claire feel invisible. So Claire came, not to prove anything to Grant, not to parade a new life before people who had never respected the old one. She came because the foundation mattered, because children with rare illnesses needed rooms that did not feel like waiting areas for fear, and because Claire had learned that quiet help was still help, even when no one applauded it. At the registration table, a young volunteer searched the guest list and frowned politely. "Claire Whitman?" she asked. "Yes." Moral documents dressed up as logistics. The best tables sat near the stage, under the warmest light, where photographers could catch the right profiles and the right diamonds. Table 12 was for distant cousins, minor donors, widowed friends of board members, and women whose names once mattered because of the men beside them. Claire placed her clutch beside her plate and smoothed the linen napkin over her lap. Across the ballroom, she saw Grant before he saw her. He stood near the silent auction display, tall and polished in a black tuxedo, his blonde hair brushed back with the same disciplined precision he applied to legal briefs and apologies he did not mean. Vanessa stood beside him in a silver dress that caught every chandelier in the room. She laughed with her head tipped back, one hand resting lightly on Grant's sleeve, as if even her gestures had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. Around them clustered Grant's friends, men Claire remembered from charity boards, golf weekends, and dinner parties where everyone spoke about public service in voices loud enough for private benefit. There was Preston Hale, who had once asked Claire if she ever got bored just being supportive. There was Mason Reed, who owned 3 vacation homes and somehow always forgot his wallet when a waiter brought a bill meant to be split. And there was Caroline Mercer, elegant as a sharpened letter opener, scanning the room for people more useful than the one she was currently speaking to. Claire had known them all. More precisely, she had been known by them, which was different and much colder. She had arranged flowers for their dinners, remembered their children's birthdays, sent handwritten notes after surgeries and funerals, and listened to their stories with a patience they mistook for emptiness. They had liked her best when she required nothing. Grant turned then, and their eyes met across the glittering room. For 1 second, something moved across his face, surprise first, then discomfort, then the quick social calculation of a man deciding how much kindness an ex-wife deserved in public. He gave her a small nod. Not warm enough to invite conversation. Not cold enough to be called rude. A perfect little cowardice in formal wear. Vanessa followed his gaze. Claire watched the recognition settle in. Vanessa leaned closer to Grant and whispered something. Preston glanced over next. Then Mason. Then Caroline. Their eyes landed on Claire the way people look at a framed photograph in a hallway. Briefly, politely, already moving on. Claire lifted her water glass and took a slow sip. The coldness steadied her. She remembered a night 6 years earlier in a Beacon Hill townhouse. When Grant had interrupted her mid-sentence to explain a tax credit she understood better than he did. Everyone had laughed gently, not because it was funny, but because powerful men often rent laughter from the people around them. Afterward, in the car, Claire had told him it embarrassed her. Grant had sighed and said, "You take things too personally." That was one of his favorite phrases. It meant, in translation, I would prefer not to be accountable for the wound I just made. A server placed a salad in front of her, baby arugula with pear slices and walnuts arranged like someone had charged $200 for the concept of restraint. Claire thanked him. He smiled, genuinely, and for a moment she felt more visible to him than to half the room. Then Margaret Ellis appeared at the edge of table 12, moving with the quick, purposeful grace of a woman holding an entire nonprofit together with manners, donor calls, and probably too much coffee. She was in her early 60s, her silver hair swept neatly back, her black velvet jacket softened by a blue ribbon pin for the foundation. When she saw Claire, her face changed completely. Not with social recognition. With relief. With affection. "Claire," Margaret said, taking both of her hands. "I am so glad you came." Truth. Not flattery. Not pity. Just truth, placed gently where a person could reach it. Across the ballroom, Claire saw Grant watching them now, his expression tightening with the faint irritation of a man discovering that someone he had filed away as irrelevant still had a witness. Margaret stayed only a minute, because a gala director is never allowed to belong to a single conversation for long. A staff member in a black suit touched her elbow and murmured something about the auction order, and Margaret's expression tightened so briefly most people would have missed it. Claire did not. She had learned to read small changes in women who were trying not to fall apart in expensive rooms. "We will talk later," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "I want to hear everything. Only if you promise not to make me talk about myself for too long," Claire replied. Margaret laughed softly. Still the same Claire. But as she turned away, Claire saw her check her phone again, saw the color drain from her face by half a shade, saw her close the screen as if shutting a door on bad news. Across the ballroom, the evening moved forward with the bright, polished confidence of a machine that had no idea one of its gears had cracked. A master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, a local television anchor with perfect teeth and a voice trained to make tragedy sound sponsor-friendly. He welcomed everyone to the annual Harbor Light Children's Foundation Gala, thanked the host committee, thanked the board, thanked the platinum sponsors, and thanked, with special warmth, people who had paid enough to deserve adjectives. The room applauded itself with sincere enthusiasm, which Claire had always found to be one of the more reliable hobbies of the wealthy. Then the screens behind the stage came alive with photographs from the pediatric recovery program. Children in hospital gowns painting birdhouses. Parents sleeping upright in chairs. Nurses kneeling beside small beds with the patient tenderness of people who understood that comfort was sometimes a form of medicine. The room grew quieter, leaned forward without meaning to. One photograph showed a little girl with a purple knit cap holding a cardboard star that said, "I want to go home for Christmas." Another showed a boy no older than 7 standing between his parents outside a treatment room, grinning as if bravery had simply been assigned to him, and he had decided not to disappoint anyone. Claire felt the familiar ache rise in her throat. Not dramatic, not fragile, just human. This was why she had come. Not for Grant. Not for Vanessa. Not for the pleasure of being ignored by people who treated empathy like a tax deduction. The video ended with a rendering of the planned new recovery wing. 6,000 square feet of light-filled treatment rooms, family sleeping suites, therapy spaces, and a rooftop garden designed for children who had seen too much ceiling tile. The goal appeared on the screen, $2 million remaining. A reasonable goal, the anchor said, in a room where several people had spent more than that on second homes they described as little places on the Cape. Laughter rippled when he joked that tonight was the perfect night to make accountants nervous. Then the pledge cards went out. Grant's table responded first, naturally. Preston raised his hand with theatrical humility and pledged $25,000. Mason followed with $15,000, adding something about the children being our future, a phrase so worn out it should have been retired with ceremony. Caroline pledged $10,000 through her family office and made sure the photographer was near enough to document the sacrifice. Grant stood last, buttoning his tuxedo jacket before speaking, because even generosity needed tailoring. Whitman Pierce is honored to support Harbor Light with $50,000 tonight, he said. The applause was immediate and admiring. Grant accepted it with the grave nod of a man who had just rescued civilization from poor branding. Claire clapped politely. $50,000 was not nothing. It would help, leaned against his arm, glowing as if she had personally invented compassion. Then, inevitably, Grant's eyes found Claire again. This time, he crossed the room. Vanessa came with him, silver dress flashing like a warning light. Her shoulders stiff, her eyes fixed on the rendering of the recovery wing as if she were watching a promise begin to disappear. For the next 10 minutes, the gala continued as if generosity alone could keep numbers from becoming real. The salads were cleared, the entrees arrived under silver domes, and the ballroom filled again with the soft machinery of polite conversation. Claire watched Margaret from across the room. The older woman moved from table to table with the same practiced smile, but the smile no longer reached her eyes. Twice she stepped into the corridor with her phone. Twice she returned a little paler. By the time the roasted chicken and asparagus were placed in front of Claire, Margaret's hands were clasped so tightly around her folder that the knuckles showed white beneath her rings. Claire had seen that look before. Not at galas, not beneath chandeliers, but in hospital waiting rooms, in foundation offices, in quiet meetings where good people had to make impossible decisions because someone with more money had changed his mind. Across the aisle, Grant's table had recovered from its brief performance of kindness and returned to the safer sport of ranking other people. Preston was telling a story about a ski lodge in Vermont. Mason was explaining why nonprofit boards needed real financial discipline, which was rich coming from a man who once spent $9,000 shipping a wine cabinet from Napa because the local options lacked personality. Caroline was praising Vanessa's dress with the faint resentment of a woman who complimented beauty the way governments signed treaties, only when necessary and never without suspicion. Grant kept glancing toward Claire, not often enough to be obvious, but often enough to reveal that her presence had become an itch beneath his collar. She knew that look too. Grant disliked unfinished stories, especially when he had written himself as the hero and someone else had refused to remain in the role assigned to them. Vanessa noticed. "You keep looking over there," she said softly, though not softly enough. "I am making sure she is comfortable," Grant replied. Preston laughed. "Grant, she is at table 12, not a refugee camp." A few people smiled. Not loudly. These people rarely did cruelty loudly. They preferred it chilled, poured into crystal, and served with plausible deniability. Claire did not react. She cut a small piece of chicken, though she had no appetite, and thought about the first year after the divorce. Grant had taken the house in Brookline, the friends, the holiday invitations, and almost every story people told about what had happened. Claire had taken a one-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, 3 boxes of books, and a silence so complete it frightened her at first. But silence, she had discovered, was not emptiness. Silence was space. Into that space, she had placed work. First one grant review, then one donor partnership, then a small advisory fund created from the portion of her mother's estate Grant had never bothered to ask about because it did not glitter in a way he respected. She had named it Whitman Grace Impact Fund, partly because Whitman was still her legal name then, and partly because Grace was the one thing she refused to let him take from her. At first, the fund was modest, almost private. A pediatric therapy room in Worcester. Emergency housing for mothers leaving unstable marriages. Medical transportation vouchers for families who lived too far from Boston hospitals and too close to running out of money. Claire did not attend ribbon cuttings. She did not give interviews. She read applications late at night, with tea cooling beside her laptop, looking for the places where one signature could move a life from despair toward breath. Then the fun grew. Quiet money attracted quiet trust. A retired surgeon introduced her to a hospital administrator. A family office in Chicago matched her first major gift. A technology founder from Seattle asked if she would manage his charitable commitments after his daughter's recovery from leukemia. By the third year, Whitman Grace was no longer small. It was simply discreet, which confused people who believed importance always arrived with a spotlight and a leather chair. Claire looked toward Margaret again. This time, Margaret was standing near the stage with the board chair, an elderly man named Warren Pike, whose red bow tie seemed to be doing most of his personality's heavy lifting. He was whispering sharply, his face tight with embarrassment. Margaret shook her head once, then looked at the screen where the rendering of the recovery wing waited like a beautiful promise no one could afford to keep. Claire felt the shift before the room did. The music lowered. The anchor returned to the podium earlier than scheduled. Staff members stopped moving between tables. Conversations thinned, one by one, until only the clink of glass and the restless cough of a donor near the front broke the hush. Margaret stepped beside the anchor, and the folder in her hands trembled just enough for Claire to see. Something had happened. Something more than nervous donors and delayed pledges. Grant straightened in his chair. Vanessa's smile faded into alert curiosity. Preston leaned back, prepared to be entertained by someone else's problem. Claire set down her fork and placed her hand over the small black clutch beside her plate. Inside it was a checkbook she had brought almost as an afterthought, though now she wondered whether part of her had known better. Human beings call it instinct when the mind notices what pride refuses to name. Claire called it paying attention. Margaret took the microphone. Her voice, usually steady as a church bell, came out thin but controlled. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to share an unexpected development regarding tonight's campaign. The room became very still. Claire saw Grant's eyes move from Margaret to the screen, then back again. For the first time all evening, no one was looking through the quiet woman at table 12. Not yet at her, not really. But the room had stopped pretending everything was fine, and that was always where truth found its first opening. Margaret held the microphone with both hands, though she tried to make it look natural. The anchor stepped slightly aside, surrendering the stage with the uncomfortable smile of a man who had been trained to introduce bad news but not stand inside it. Behind Margaret, the glowing rendering of the recovery wing remained on the screen, all sunlight and clean windows and small painted chairs, a future so gentle it made the silence in the room feel cruel. As many of you know, Margaret began. This expansion has been in planning for nearly 2 years. The new pediatric recovery wing would allow Harbor Light to serve an additional 400 families each year, including families who travel more than 50 miles for treatment and cannot afford extended hotel stays in Boston. Her voice steadied on the facts. Claire understood that. Facts were easier than fear. Numbers gave sorrow a railing to hold. Tonight, we expected to close the final funding gap with the support of a lead matching donor. Unfortunately, less than an hour ago, we were informed that donor is unable to proceed. A soft disturbance moved through the ballroom. Not a gasp exactly, more like the sound of expensive people realizing the evening had stopped flattering them. Warren Pike, the board chair with the red bow tie, stood near the stage looking as if he had personally been betrayed by arithmetic. Margaret continued, "Without that match, we are still short $2 million. If we cannot secure the commitment by Friday at noon, the contractor will release the reserved build schedule, and the project will be delayed at least 18 months. 18 months. Claire watched those words land differently around the room. To some guests, 18 months meant inconvenience, another campaign, another gala, another chance to wear a dress and call it sacrifice. To the families in those photographs, 18 months was a winter in a motel room, a parent sleeping in a car, a child receiving treatment in a room never designed for comfort. Margaret looked down, then back up. I know this is unexpected. I also know this room has never failed these children. It was a brave sentence. It was also a dangerous one, because rooms failed people all the time. They simply hired caterers first. The anchor returned to the microphone with forced brightness. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you heard Margaret. This is the moment when Boston shows what community really means. He began calling for emergency pledges, raising the energy as if volume could manufacture courage. At the front tables, people shifted in their chairs. A man from a real estate family pledged $100,000, but only after confirming aloud that naming recognition would still be available. A biotech executive offered $50,000 and promised to circle back about more after consulting his team. Caroline Mercer leaned toward Vanessa and murmured that this was terribly awkward, which was perhaps the most Caroline sentence ever built by the English language. Grant stood again. The room turned toward him with relief, because people liked Grant in a crisis. He had the posture of a solution, even when the solution belonged to someone else. Whitman Pierce will increase our commitment to $100,000, he announced. The applause came quickly, grateful for something to do. Grant glanced toward Claire as he sat, and for a moment she saw the old hunger in him, not hunger to help, but hunger to be seen helping. Vanessa touched his arm approvingly. Preston nodded as if Grant had just moved mountains instead of adjusting a line item. The anchor called for more. The room produced fragments. 20,000, 10,000, 25,000. A promise from a donor-advised fund in the spring. A possible corporate sponsorship next quarter. The numbers gathered like coins in a fountain, meaningful, shiny, nowhere near enough. Claire looked at Margaret. The older woman's smile had become almost painful. She thanked each donor by name, because gratitude was part of her job, even when gratitude had to stand beside disappointment and pretend they were not related. At Grant's table, Preston lifted his wine glass and said, not quietly enough, someone should call one of those anonymous billionaires who love hospitals. Maybe table 12 has one in her purse. Mason laughed into his napkin. Vanessa's eyes slid toward Claire with bright cruelty disguised as charm. Claire has always been wonderfully practical, she said. Maybe she can organize a book drive. This time, even Grant looked uncomfortable. But again, he said nothing. Claire felt the silence from him arrive before the insult did, and somehow that silence was older, heavier, more familiar. She did not look at Vanessa. She did not look at Preston. She looked at the screen, at the little girl with the purple knit cap and the cardboard star. Then she opened her clutch. Inside, beneath her phone and a folded program, was the slim leather checkbook embossed with the initials of Whitman Grace Impact Fund. Claire rested her fingertips on it for one quiet second. Not for drama, not for revenge, for certainty. Because money, in the right hands, was not a trophy. It was a bridge. And some bridges needed to be built before noon on Friday. Claire did not move immediately. That was the part no one would remember later, because people prefer their miracles dramatic, preferably with music and a flattering light. But for several seconds, she sat at table 12 with her hand inside her clutch, touching the edge of the checkbook, listening to the room bargain with its own conscience. The anchor's voice rose and fell from the stage, polished into optimism that had begun to sound desperate. Can we get another 100,000? Who will stand with these families tonight? A few people clapped as if applause could be deposited by Friday. Warren Pike whispered to Margaret again, his red bow tie bobbing anxiously. Margaret nodded, but Claire saw the truth in the way the older woman held herself, shoulders square, chin lifted, heart sinking somewhere no evening gown could hide. Grant's table had become a small theater of concern. Preston leaned back with his arms folded, performing seriousness now that humor had become too risky. Mason scrolled through his phone, probably checking whether compassion was deductible before dessert. Caroline was speaking in a low voice about whether the board should have diversified its donor base, which was a very elegant way to blame a sinking ship for not having enough lifeboats. Vanessa looked bored until she noticed Claire still watching the stage. Then she smiled. "You seem very moved," Vanessa said. "That is nice." Claire turned her head slowly. "It is moving. It must be hard." Vanessa continued, tilting her champagne flute without drinking from it. "Coming back into these circles after so much has changed." Grant's eyes flicked toward her. "Vanessa, what?" "I mean it kindly." She did not. Kindness had never sounded so much like perfume sprayed over smoke. Events like this can feel overwhelming if you have been away from them. Claire looked at the woman sitting beside her ex-husband, at the smooth hair, the silver dress, the confidence borrowed from a man who mistook attention for loyalty. 3 years ago, that comment might have opened a wound. Tonight it opened nothing. "I have been busy," Claire said. Preston gave a low laugh. "With Cambridge book clubs?" Mason added, Do not underestimate book clubs. My mother's raised almost $5,000 for the library last year. The table chuckled. Grant did not. He was watching Claire too closely now, as if some delayed instinct had finally begun tapping at the glass inside his mind. He knew her old silences. He did not know this one. This silence was not submission. It was measurement. On stage, the anchor announced the current emergency total. With gratitude to everyone who has stepped forward, we have raised $480,000 toward the remaining gap. The applause that followed was thinner than before. $480,000 was a beautiful number until placed beside $2 million, where it suddenly looked like a child standing beside a courthouse. Margaret thanked the room again. Her voice nearly held. Nearly. Claire saw the moment it faltered, just one syllable, a small fracture no microphone could fully hide. That was what made Claire rise. Not Vanessa. Not Preston. Not Grant's silence. Not the old humiliation dressed up in tuxedos. It was Margaret's voice cracking under the weight of children whose names most of these guests would never learn. Claire stood so quietly that no one noticed at first. She picked up her clutch, slipped the checkbook into her hand, and walked around the back of table 12. The carpet swallowed the sound of her steps. She passed the silent auction display, where a Cape Cod weekend had received more bids than the Pediatric Therapy Fund. She passed the floral arrangements, each one probably expensive enough to cover a family's hotel stay for a week. Human priorities, she thought, were often just absurdity with a seating chart. When she reached the aisle, Grant finally stood. Claire. His voice was low, uncertain. She paused, but did not turn fully. Not now, Grant. 2 words. Calm, plain, devastating in their refusal to ask permission. She continued toward the stage. Margaret saw her first. Confusion crossed her face, followed by concern. Perhaps she thought Claire was leaving. Perhaps she thought the evening had become too painful. The anchor lowered the microphone slightly as Claire approached the stairs. A staff member moved as if to stop her, but Margaret lifted one hand. It is all right, Margaret said, though she clearly had no idea whether it was. Claire climbed the 3 steps to the stage, aware now of the room noticing her at last. Conversation faded behind her in ripples. Grant stood frozen beside his chair. Vanessa's smile had disappeared. Preston leaned forward, suddenly deprived of jokes. Claire reached Margaret and spoke softly, away from the microphone. If the full amount were secured tonight, could the project stay on schedule? Margaret blinked. Yes, but Claire, the amount remaining is I know. Claire opened the checkbook. Her hand was steady. Then tell me the exact number you need to make sure no family loses that wing because someone else changed his mind. Margaret stared at Claire as if the question had arrived from a place beyond ordinary accounting. For a moment, the microphone between them picked up nothing but the soft static of the sound system and the distant clink of someone setting down a fork too carefully. Claire, Margaret whispered, we cannot ask you to do that. You are not asking, Claire said. I am offering. Margaret's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back with the discipline of a woman who had spent decades making sure other people could break down first. She glanced toward Warren Pike, then toward the anchor, then back to Claire. The exact remaining gap, after tonight's emergency pledges, is $1,520,000. Her voice was barely audible, but we also need contingency funding for the family lodging program attached to the wing. That is another $400,000, at minimum. Claire nodded once. So $2 million would protect the build schedule and the lodging program. Margaret swallowed. Yes. Claire looked out over the ballroom. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, simply to understand the room she was about to change. The faces below were arranged in layers of confusion. Some guests looked curious, some irritated, some faintly amused, as though table 12 had accidentally wandered into the center of a play. Grant stood beside his chair, one hand resting on the back of it, his mouth slightly open. Vanessa's expression had tightened into something smooth and guarded. Preston looked as if he had just realized the punchline might be about him. Claire turned back to the checkbook. The leather cover opened with a small sound, ordinary as a door hinge. She wrote carefully, because even private acts deserve clean handwriting when they carry public consequences. Date: Harbor Light Children's Foundation. Amount: $2,500,000. She chose the number before anyone could negotiate her downward with gratitude. $2 million to close the gap. $500,000 for family lodging, transportation, meals, and the quiet emergencies that never looked impressive on donor plaques but decided whether parents could stay beside their children. On the memo line, she wrote, Pediatric Recovery Wing and Family Support Fund. Then she signed her name, Claire Whitman. The name looked different to her now than it had on divorce papers, dinner invitations, and sympathy cards from people relieved that someone else's marriage had failed instead of theirs. For years, Whitman had been the name that tied her to Grant in other people's minds. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like something she had taken back and put to work. She tore the check free and handed it to Margaret. Margaret did not take it immediately. Her gaze dropped to the amount, and all the composure left her face at once. Not in a collapse, not in spectacle, but in the small, human surrender of someone who had been holding a dam with both hands and suddenly felt the water recede. Claire, she breathed. The anchor leaned closer, saw the figure, and forgot every polished phrase he had ever been paid to remember. Ladies and gentlemen, he said into the microphone, his voice cracking with genuine shock, we have just received a commitment for $2,500,000. The room did not applaud. Not at first. Silence struck it clean through. A deep, stunned silence. The kind that does not come from boredom or manners, but from people realizing their assumptions have failed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Margaret lifted the check with trembling fingers. From the Whitman Grace Impact Fund. The anchor continued, reading the name from the check, signed by Claire Whitman. That was when the whispering began. It moved from table to table like wind finding dry leaves. Whitman Grace. The name meant something to the people who paid attention to philanthropy beyond photo captions. A woman near the front covered her mouth. A hospital trustee turned sharply to his wife. Warren Pike removed his glasses, cleaned them with his pocket square, then put them back on as if the numbers might become smaller if viewed through fresh lenses. Grant went pale. Not dramatically pale, not movie pale, but the real kind, where the blood leaves a man's face because his memory is rearranging itself without permission. Whitman Grace. Mason whispered. That fund paid for the neonatal transport units in Providence. Caroline's smile vanished. And the Women's Housing Initiative in Chicago, she said, almost unwillingly. Vanessa looked at Grant. You knew about this? Grant did not answer, because the truth was standing on stage in a navy dress, and for once he had no language polished enough to cover it. Claire stepped toward the microphone, though she did not touch it. Please do not make this about me, she said softly, and somehow the microphone caught every word. Make it about the children who should not have to wait 18 months because adults with resources needed more time to feel generous. Another silence followed, different from the first. Sharper, more deserved. Then Margaret began to clap. One pair of hands, unsteady but certain. The nurse at table 9 joined her. Then the young volunteer from registration. Then the parents seated near the stage. Within seconds, the whole ballroom rose, chairs shifting back, napkins falling, applause swelling beneath the chandeliers until even the people who had ignored Claire had to stand in the sound of what she had done. The applause rose around Claire like weather, warm and enormous and slightly unreal. She stood beside Margaret beneath the chandelier light, not smiling for the cameras, not lifting a hand in triumph, not doing any of the things people expected from a woman who had just rearranged the hierarchy of a room with a pen. She only stepped back from the microphone and looked at Margaret, whose eyes were bright now with something too honest to be managed. You saved it, Margaret whispered. Claire shook her head gently. No, the work saved it. I only paid an overdue bill. That made Margaret laugh through the tears she refused to let fall, and somehow the small laugh cut through Claire more deeply than the standing ovation. Below the stage, the guests kept clapping because stopping would have required them to return to the awkward business of remembering who they had been 10 minutes earlier. Some applauded because they were moved. Some applauded because everyone else was. Some applauded because social survival often looks suspiciously like morality when the lighting is good. Claire could see it all from the stage. The nurse at table 9 had both hands pressed to her chest. The young volunteer from registration was crying openly, her mascara surrendering in thin black lines. A father near the front row, one of the family speakers scheduled for later that evening, held his wife's hand and mouthed the words thank you with a kind of stunned gratitude that made Claire look away before her own composure betrayed her. Then her eyes found Grant. He was still standing beside his chair, but the applause around him seemed not to reach him. His face carried a confusion Claire had never seen there before. Grant knew success. He understood money when it arrived wearing a title, a corner office, a framed deal announcement, a man's name on a building. But this was different. This was money he had not controlled, influence he had not noticed, power he had misread because it had not asked his permission to exist. Vanessa clapped slowly, her expression carefully rebuilt into admiration, but the effort showed at the edges. Preston clapped with the enthusiasm of a man trying to erase the last 15 minutes from the public record. Mason leaned toward Caroline and whispered something, but Caroline did not answer. She was staring at Claire with the cold concentration of someone recalculating every past insult for possible witnesses. The anchor, finally recovering his professional voice, invited Claire to say more. "Ms. Whitman, would you like to share a few words about the fund and what inspired such an extraordinary gift?" The room quieted again, eager now, hungry for the origin story they had not cared to ask for when she was seated behind a marble column. Claire stepped toward the microphone. Her pulse was steady, though she felt the weight of every face turned toward her. "I started Whitman Grace 3 years ago," she said, "after a season of my life when I learned how easily people can disappear inside rooms that are too impressed with themselves." A faint ripple moved through the guests. Grant lowered his eyes. Claire continued, her voice calm enough to be mistaken for softness by anyone still foolish. "At first, the fund was small. A few medical transportation grants, emergency housing, therapy rooms, things that do not always make headlines, but make life possible for people carrying more than anyone can see." She looked toward the screen, toward the children in the photographs. "I did not plan to speak tonight. I came because Margaret Ellis once treated me with dignity at a time when I had forgotten what that felt like. And because this foundation does work that matters when no camera is present." Margaret pressed a hand over her mouth. Claire turned back to the room. "So please, when you remember this evening, do not remember a check. Remember the children who should not have to wait for adults to finish performing generosity. Remember the parents who need a bed near the hospital, not another promise to revisit the budget next quarter. And remember that quiet people are not empty. Sometimes they are simply listening long enough to learn where help is actually needed." The applause came again, but this time it was slower at first, heavier, less polished. Claire stepped away from the microphone before it could become about her. That was when Grant began moving toward the stage, pushing through the standing crowd with the dazed purpose of a man approaching a door he had locked years ago, only to find someone else had built an entire house beyond it. Grant reached the side of the stage before Claire had fully stepped down, and for one strange moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath around them. He looked smaller from this distance, though nothing about him had physically changed. Same tailored tuxedo, same careful posture, same expensive watch catching the light at his wrist. But the certainty had gone out of him, and without certainty, Grant Whitman was simply a man standing in a room he no longer understood. "Claire," he said, and there was something unguarded in his voice that might once have moved her. "Can we talk?" Around them, people pretended not to listen with the desperate skill of people absolutely listening. Margaret touched Claire's arm gently, a silent offer of rescue, but Claire shook her head once. She was not afraid of this conversation. Fear belonged to the woman who used to rehearse her sentences before speaking to her own husband. That woman had paid her tuition and humiliation and graduated years ago. "We can talk here," Claire said. Grant glanced at the guests nearby, then lowered his voice. "I had no idea." It was the first honest thing he had said all night, and still it landed badly. Claire looked at him with a calm that made him blink. "I know. Why did you never tell me?" The question was so perfectly Grant that Claire almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was tragic in the most predictable way. He had just discovered a part of her life he had never earned access to, and somehow he had made the discovery feel like something withheld from him. "You stopped asking who I was a long time before the divorce," she said. The words were quiet, but they reached him. His jaw tightened. Behind him, Vanessa had drifted closer, no longer glowing, no longer bored. Preston, Mason, and Caroline hovered near the front of the stage, suddenly fascinated by the floral arrangements and failing its subtlety so thoroughly it deserved a small award. Grant swallowed. I did not know you were capable of something like this. There it was. The sentence that explained the marriage more cleanly than any court document ever had. Claire studied his face, and for a brief second, she did not see the polished attorney or the public man or the husband who had let rooms diminish her because it was convenient. She saw the boy he must have been once, praised too early, corrected too little, taught that women who loved him were meant to orbit, not shine. It did not excuse him. It only made him sadder. That is because you confused quiet with incapable, she said. A lot of people do. It saves them the trouble of looking closer. Vanessa stepped in with a careful smile that had been assembled very quickly from whatever pieces of dignity she could find. Claire, what you did tonight was truly extraordinary. I hope you did not misunderstand anything earlier. We were only trying to be lighthearted. Claire turned to her. I understood you perfectly. Vanessa's smile held for 1 second, then softened into something less useful. Caroline appeared beside them with a voice dipped in honey and panic. Claire, I must say, I have followed some of Whitman Grace's work. I had no idea you were behind it. We should have lunch sometime. No, thank you, Claire said. Not rude, not sharp, just complete. Caroline's mouth opened, then closed, which was rare enough that several tax attorneys in the room probably felt a disturbance in the atmosphere. Preston cleared his throat. Well, I hope you know nobody meant any harm tonight. That is interesting, Claire said, looking at him. People often say that after harm becomes visible. Grant looked down. The applause had faded now, replaced by that strange post-revelation murmur, the sound of a social order quietly editing itself. The anchor was speaking again on stage, thanking donors, praising community, trying to pull the evening back into shape before it collapsed into too much honesty. Margaret was surrounded by board members, some tearful, some relieved. Warren Pike still polishing his glasses as if reality had smudged them. Claire turned to go, but Grant reached out, stopping short of touching her. At least he had learned that much. I am sorry, he said. The words were simple. Too late, but simple. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Once, she had wanted that apology so badly, she would have mistaken its arrival for healing. Now it felt like finding a key to a house she no longer lived in. I believe you are sorry tonight, she said. I hope one day you become sorry in a way that changes you when no one is watching. His face shifted, wounded by the mercy of it more than any insult would have managed. Claire walked past him then, not toward the back of the room where table 12 waited beneath its marble column, but toward the families near the front, where a little boy's mother was crying into a napkin and reaching for Claire's hand, as if gratitude itself needed somewhere to go. The mother near the front row was named Angela Rivera. Though Claire only learned that when Margaret introduced them through tears, she was still pretending not to have. Angela wore a dark green dress that looked carefully chosen and slightly uncomfortable, the kind of dress a person buys for one important night and then hopes never has to be returned. Beside her stood her husband, Daniel, one hand resting on the back of their son's chair. The boy was 8 years old, thin as a reed, with serious brown eyes and a blue blazer that seemed a little too stiff at the shoulders. His name was Lucas. On the screen earlier, he had been the child holding the cardboard star. In person, he looked smaller and braver, which Claire had learned was often how courage appeared when it had no choice. Angela took Claire's hand in both of hers. You do not know us, she said, her voice trembling. But that wing means families like ours do not have to choose between being close to treatment and keeping the lights on at home. Claire closed her fingers gently around Angela's. Then I am glad it will be built. Lucas looked up at her with solemn curiosity. Are you the lady who gave the money? Claire knelt slightly, so he would not have to tilt his head so far. I helped with some of it. That is a lot of money, he said. It is, Claire replied. But you are worth more. His mother covered her mouth, and Daniel looked away toward the chandelier with the expression of a man trying very hard to keep his face steady in public. Claire understood that too. Public gratitude could feel almost as exposing as grief. Around them, the gala had begun rearranging itself around the new version of the story. Board members who had not noticed Claire all evening now approached with both hands extended. A city councilman asked whether she would be open to discussing future partnerships. A hospital trustee told her he had admired Whitman Grace for years, which might even have been true, though admiration was easier once it came with a name tag. The young volunteer from registration apologized for seating her at table 12, as if she personally had designed the hierarchy of Boston philanthropy on a clipboard. Claire told her not to worry. The girl looked relieved enough to make Claire's heart ache. None of this was her fault. Most people were born into systems already arranged to make them mistake placement for worth. Grant stayed near the edge of the crowd, trapped between wanting to approach again and knowing he had already received the answer he deserved. Vanessa stood beside him now, quieter than before. Without her practiced brightness, she looked younger, almost uncertain. Claire did not hate her. Hatred would have required energy Vanessa had not earned. In another life, perhaps Vanessa would one day discover that being chosen by a man like Grant was not the same as being cherished by him. That lesson was expensive. Claire hoped, despite herself, that Vanessa would not have to pay full price. Preston attempted to re-enter the conversation with a booming compliment about generosity, but the room had shifted enough that his voice sounded suddenly too large for his character. Claire, extraordinary. Really extraordinary. We were just joking earlier, you know. How these nights are. Claire looked at him until his smile weakened. I know exactly how these nights are. It was not an accusation. That made it worse. Mason suddenly remembered someone across the room. Caroline murmured something about checking on the auction totals. Preston retreated with the stiff dignity of a man who had stepped on his own reflection. Margaret watched the little exchange from a few feet away, and when Claire turned back, the older woman was smiling. Not triumphantly. Kindly. You have no idea what you did tonight, Margaret said. Claire glanced toward Lucas, who was showing the young volunteer his cardboard star from the video, explaining that purple was his lucky color. I think I have some idea. The press will want a statement. They can have the foundation's statement. Not mine. Margaret sighed, half amused, half exasperated. You donate $2,500,000 in the middle of a gala and then refuse attention. You are a public relations nightmare. I have been called worse in nicer rooms. Margaret laughed, and this time the laugh was steady. Across the ballroom, the anchor announced that the recovery wing was fully funded, and the room erupted again, but Claire heard it differently now. Not as applause for her, as relief becoming sound. The chandeliers glittered overhead. The flowers stood absurdly tall on their tables. The champagne kept bubbling as if nothing sacred had happened among all that expensive glass. Human beings were ridiculous creatures, Claire thought, forever needing ceremony to recognize what should have been obvious. Children mattered, dignity mattered, and the worth of a woman had never depended on how loudly a room welcomed her. She looked down at Lucas, who was now waving his cardboard star at his parents, and for the first time that evening, Claire smiled without armor. The evening did not end after the announcement, because expensive events rarely know when to stop congratulating themselves. Dessert arrived, small towers of chocolate mousse with gold leaf on top, as if even pudding needed to network. The string quartet returned to something gentle and harmless. Photographers moved through the ballroom with renewed purpose, capturing Margaret with board members, families with foundation staff, nurses beside the rendering of the recovery wing that no longer looked like a dream suspended over a cliff. Claire stayed near Lucas and his parents for several minutes, letting the crowd swell and settle without allowing herself to become the center of it again. Angela told her about the months of driving from Lowell before sunrise, about packing snacks because hospital cafeterias became expensive when every appointment lasted longer than expected, about pretending to be cheerful in front of Lucas while calculating gas money in the parking garage. Claire listened, not the way donors listened when they were waiting for a quote to put in a newsletter, but the way a person listens when she understands that survival often lives in details too small for speeches. Daniel said little, but when he finally spoke, his voice was rough. People keep saying families like ours are strong, he said. Most days, we are just tired. Claire nodded. Being tired and continuing anyway is still strength. Lucas, who had been turning his cardboard star between his fingers, looked up at her. Will the new place have windows? I think it will have many windows, Claire said, and a garden on the roof. His eyes widened. A real garden? A real one. He considered this with the seriousness of a small architect. Then it should have purple flowers. Angela laughed softly, wiping her eyes. He has been very committed to purple lately. Purple is a respectable position, Claire said. I will make sure Margaret knows. Lucas smiled then, shy but bright, and that smile gave Claire something no applause in the ballroom could have given her. It gave the money a face. Across the room, Grant watched the exchange from near the bar, his drink untouched in his hand. Vanessa stood beside him, speaking in a low voice, but he seemed not to hear her. Claire did not feel victorious when she noticed him. Victory, she had learned, was often just grief wearing better shoes. There had been a time when she would have wanted him to see this, to feel small, to understand what he had thrown away. But, now that he did, she found no sweetness in it. Only distance. He was part of a life she had once mistaken for the whole world. Tonight, that world looked like a snow globe, glittering, sealed, and too small to breathe inside. Margaret returned to Claire with Warren Pike trailing behind her. Warren had recovered enough to form complete sentences again, which was apparently what $2,500,000 could do for a man's nervous system. "Ms. Whitman," he said, taking her hand in both of his. "On behalf of the board, I cannot adequately express our gratitude." "Then do not try too hard," Claire said kindly. "Put it into the project." Warren blinked, then laughed because he was not entirely sure whether she had made a joke, and rich men were terrified of missing jokes from richer women. Margaret gave Claire a look that was half admiration and half warning not to make the board chair faint before coffee. "We will put every dollar exactly where it belongs," Margaret said. "I know," Claire replied. "That is why I gave it to you." The simple trust in that sentence undid Margaret more than the check had. Her lips pressed together, and for a moment she looked not like a director, not like the woman responsible for budgets and donors and impossible deadlines, but like someone who had been seen clearly after years of being useful to everyone. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. Claire touched her arm. "You asked me once what I cared about. I think tonight I finally answered properly." Margaret smiled through the shine in her eyes. Before either of them could say more, Caroline Mercer approached with two other women from Grant's circle, all three wearing the bright, careful expressions of people arriving late to decency and hoping there might still be seating. "Claire," Caroline said, "we were just saying how inspiring this all is. Truly, we had no idea you were doing such meaningful work." Claire looked at them, remembering years of being asked to refill wine glasses at dinner parties in her own home, while Grant discussed markets with men who never learned where the kitchen was. "Most meaningful work happens before people decide to notice it," she said. Caroline's smile froze, then rearranged itself. "That is very true." It was not, Claire suspected, a sentence Caroline had believed until this exact emergency. But perhaps belief sometimes began as embarrassment. Humans had built worse religions on less. Claire excused herself and walked toward the hallway outside the ballroom. The noise softened behind her as soon as she passed through the doors. In the quiet corridor, with its patterned carpet and framed photographs of Boston in winter, she finally exhaled. Her reflection appeared in a dark window at the end of the hall. Navy dress, silver watch, no diamonds, no escort, no need to be introduced by anyone. For the first time all night, Claire allowed herself to feel the weight of what had happened, not the money, not the applause, but the strange, tender fact that she had walked into a room designed to overlook her and had left something living behind. Claire stood in the quiet corridor for nearly a minute, letting the ballroom noise become something distant and harmless behind the closed doors. The window at the end of the hall reflected Boston in winter, headlights sliding along Boylston Street, bare trees trembling in the cold, the city carrying on with the rude indifference of places that have seen too many human dramas to pause for one more. Her phone buzzed inside her clutch. A message from her assistant at Whitman Grace appeared on the screen. Saw the pledge alert. Confirming wire instructions with Harbor Light tomorrow morning. "Proud of you." Claire smiled faintly. Practical people were underrated. They did not faint. They did not make speeches. They simply made sure miracles cleared the bank. She typed back, "Thank you. Please add a note that $500,000 is restricted to family support, lodging, transportation, and meals." Then she put the phone away. Behind her, the ballroom doors opened softly. She knew who it was before he spoke, not because of romance or memory or any of the nonsense people use to make bad decisions sound poetic, but because Grant had always walked as if floors had been installed for his convenience. Tonight, even his footsteps sounded uncertain. "Claire," he said. She turned. He stood a few feet away, hands at his sides, no drink, no audience, no Vanessa beside him. Without the room watching, he looked older. Not old, but less protected by his own reflection. "I will not keep you," he said. I just wanted to say one thing without everyone staring. Claire waited. Grant looked toward the ballroom doors, then back at her. I was wrong about you. It was a small sentence, but it had taken him years to arrive at it, and even now it looked heavy in his mouth. Claire did not rush to save him from the weight. That, too, was new. Yes, she said. He gave a short, almost startled laugh, not because it was funny, but because she had not softened the truth for him. You were always kind, he continued. I mistook that for weakness. You were quiet, and I mistook that for having nothing to say. You supported me, and I mistook that for needing me. His eyes shone, though he did not cry. Grant Whitman would probably rather audit his own soul in public than cry in a hotel corridor. I am ashamed of that. Claire looked at him for a long moment. There had been years when she would have fed herself on those words. Years when she would have carried them home like proof that the pain had finally been witnessed. But healing was a strange, inconvenient little creature. It often arrived after the apology, when the apology no longer had power to decide whether you were whole. I hope you remember that shame, she said gently. Not as punishment, as instruction. He nodded slowly. Do you think you could ever forgive me? The question came quietly, and for the first time it did not sound like strategy. Claire looked past him toward the ballroom, toward the muffled sound of laughter, the clink of dishes, the room that had needed a check to learn her name. I already did, she said. Grant's face changed, relief rising too quickly. Claire lifted one hand, stopping it before it became hope. But forgiveness is not an invitation back into my life. It is just the end of your authority over my pain. The relief left him, replaced by something more sober, maybe even more useful. He nodded again. I understand. Claire was not sure he did, not fully, but understanding was his work now, not hers. The ballroom doors opened again, and Margaret stepped into the corridor, holding Lucas's cardboard star. He wanted you to have this, she said, smiling through fresh tears. The star was slightly bent at one corner, colored purple with uneven marker strokes. Across the front, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, I want to go home for Christmas. Claire took it with both hands, and that was the moment the evening finally reached her. Not the applause, not Grant's apology, not the stunned faces or the check or the whispered recalculations of people who had mistaken wealth for noise. This, a cardboard star, a child's wish, a reminder that the only power worth having was the kind that could carry someone closer to home. Grant looked at the star, then at Claire, and whatever he saw there made him step back. Good night, Claire, he said. Good night, Grant. He returned to the ballroom alone. Claire did not watch him go. She walked with Margaret toward the elevator, the star held carefully against her chest. Outside, her car was waiting beneath the hotel awning, and cold air rushed around her as the doorman opened the door. The city glittered without caring who had won or lost. Claire looked once at the hotel's golden windows, at the room where she had entered unnoticed and left unnecessary to explain. Then she stepped into the car, not as Grant's ex-wife, not as Table 12, not as the quiet woman people finally decided to see, but as herself. And that, after everything, was the richest thing she owned. The car moved away from the Copley Grand Hotel just after 10:30, sliding into the slow winter traffic of downtown Boston, while the cardboard star rested on Claire's lap, like something far more valuable than any auction item behind her. She watched the hotel shrink in the rear window, its golden entrance bright against the cold, its doorman already turning toward the next guest, the next arrival, the next small theater of importance. For years, Claire had believed leaving rooms meant losing them. Leaving Grant's house. Leaving his name in the mouths of people who used it carelessly. Leaving dinner tables, where she had learned to smile while becoming smaller. But tonight, as the city lights passed over the glass like quiet sparks, she understood something cleaner. Some rooms were not meant to keep you. Some rooms existed only so you could discover you no longer needed to ask for a place inside them. Her driver asked whether she wanted the heat turned higher. I am fine, thank you, she said, though she pulled her coat a little tighter around her shoulders. In her clutch, her phone vibrated again and again. Messages from Margaret. Messages from her assistant. Inside, the warmth greeted her like truth.